There has been a great deal that has been written about love languages and how people who live together or are married or partnered can deepen relationship with the other by learning the other's love language and then speaking that language in action. The 5 love languages created by Pastor Gary Chapman in 1992 are quality time together, words of affirmation, acts of service, physical touch, and giving gifts. While it sounds easy to just figure out how someone else feels loved and then do those things, it's not as simple as you might think. There are people who are genuinely bad at buying gifts for other people. And let me just say ahead of time, I'm not speaking of any of you, so it's safe to do this. I'm speaking about out in life somewhere. There are people who are genuinely bad at buying gifts for other people because they tend to buy gifts that they themselves would want. If that person is partnered with someone whose love language is receiving gifts, you can see where that might be problematic. Or if one person is an extrovert and loves nothing more than quality time with someone, but the other person is an introvert and chooses carefully when they spend time with anyone else, that could be tough. I've been wondering lately about how caring happens in congregations and what it looks like over a period of time. Is there an overlap between what someone's love language is and how they feel cared for in community? Or is how we feel cared for in community different from that? And do we have specific care needs based on the makeup of that specific community? Last week we talked about how community has to be formed and nurtured and sustained with intentionality. We also talked about how one of the intentional aspects of community is working on communication. Both of those are necessary for a community to be caring. Before we get into what the Bible says about caring community, I want to ask you a question. When you are entering a new community, so I want you to think about communities like church, friend groups, your work settings, a new neighborhood or living situation, volunteer groups that you're a part of. What helps you feel cared for as you enter that group? So take a few seconds and think about, how is it that you feel cared for when entering a new group? I'm going to take some educated guesses here. For some of you, feeling cared for comes when people learn your name and are intentional about using your name when they see you. We call that welcome. For some of you, feeling cared for comes when someone makes food and invites you to partake, what we call hospitality. For some of you, feeling cared for means when someone takes the time to get to know you and wants you to get to know them. Relationship. For some of you, feeling cared for means being invited to receive the gifts that others have to offer and to use the gifts you have to offer others. Reciprocity. For some of you, feeling cared for means being thanked for everything you do, from giving money to volunteering to just showing up. Appreciation. For some of you, feeling cared for means someone notices when you aren't there and lets you know that you were missed. Noticing. For some of you, feeling cared for means you trust others to tell you, wait, I wrote this. I know what I mean. Fortunately, feeling cared for means you trust others to tell you when something is going on in their life. And then, no, I was right the first time, sorry. You trust others to tell them what is going on in your life. So you're trusting someone to hear what's going on in your life. And then that person follows up with you later to ask you about the things you have shared. Connection and listening. For some of you, feeling cared for means having people show up to an event that you say is important to you, maybe even something you're in or performing, or something that's about you. Presence. Our youngish adult group that meets is incredible about showing up for each other's events. So what would you add to this list? What did I miss in that list of ways that you feel cared for when becoming a part of community? In the Bible, one of the places where community and how it gets formed or harmed is addressed is in Paul's letter to the young or just forming churches. The letter to the church in Galatia is one of those letters. Paul went on missionary journeys to various parts of what was called Asia Minor, which we know today as Turkey. On one of his first journeys, Jews and Gentiles were converted to following Jesus Christ. In this particular community, though, the Jewish converts were insisting that the Gentile converts adhere strictly to Jewish law, including circumcision. Well, it doesn't take much imagination to think the Gentile converts probably weren't too excited about that. So they were refusing, and then conflict ensued. So Paul wrote a letter to try to resolve the conflict, and in the letter he made the point that in Jesus Christ was freedom, which meant strict adherence to Jewish law was no longer required, but the new freedom was for loving and following Christ. In chapter 6 of this letter, we get a little glimpse of community life. Just before chapter 6 begins, Paul gave an image of what it looks like to live in the Spirit of God. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There is no law against things like this. And then he ends chapter 5 with, if we live by the Spirit, let's follow the Spirit. Let's not become arrogant, make each other angry, or be jealous of each other. So then chapter 6 begins with encouragement on what to do if someone is caught doing something wrong. I love this because Paul obviously knows that anytime you get a group of people together, somebody is going to do something wrong. There is no such thing as a perfect person, and so there is no such thing as perfect community. So Paul opens chapter 6 by saying, if, and we can assume he means when, someone does something wrong and the fruit of the Spirit becomes a little rotten, someone with some spiritual maturity ought to restore that person to the community with gentleness. And then he says others in the community need to be on guard so they won't fall prey to the same temptation. An example of this in churches could easily be when one or two members launch an attack against a pastor. There are healthy ways to address dissatisfaction with the pastor, and there are unhealthy ways to address dissatisfaction with a pastor. There were people in this early Christian community who questioned Paul's authority to be leading a community. They stirred up others, and then Paul had to do all this work to defend himself and his authority. The next point that Paul makes is that in community, people should be willing to carry each other's burdens. The next point, I'm sure, was probably directed to pastors. It's about humility. Have an accurate sense of yourself, not thinking you are more important than you are, but also not thinking you are less important than you are. The next point is for each person to look at their own work and not compare themselves to others. And then lastly, he says, each person will have to carry their own load, which refers to the work they do and not their burdens. So that's a little snapshot of what we might call caring community. But it needs to be unpacked a little bit. If we were going to get tossed out of every community we make a mistake in, we would never join another community. So how do we allow for people to make mistakes, even when the mistake can harm other people or harm the community? Most of you know that one of the communities I joined as of last August was the Community Commission for Public Safety and Accountability. I'm one of 7 interim commissioners, and now we have about 7 staff people. I have made some mistakes in my participation in that community, like we are sometimes prone to do. I made some assumptions about someone early on, and I wrote an email to the group about those assumptions as though the assumptions were fact. I was not kicked out of the group, but I was held accountable for the repair that needed to happen. Accountability is an important part of a caring community. If people are not held accountable for their actions, the community will not be experienced as a caring one. I'm not the only one who has made mistakes as this new community has been navigated. And sometimes I have been the one holding others accountable and trying to gently restore. How can we be gentle with each other here in this community when one of us or more have made mistakes? This is where our intentionality about communication comes in. If you don't speak up about how you have been or felt wronged or harmed, there's nothing I or anyone else can do unless we personally witness it. We all need to know that we're likely to make mistakes because some days we're able to show up as our best selves, and other days we show up as not our best selves. Knowing that someone will gently restore us to community makes all the difference. This applies even in friendship or partnership or marriage. What harms a community is when someone does something that is unkind or uncaring or hurtful, and others then join in that action, and there's no accountability. And that's when fractures in community happen. how we carry each other's burdens is complex. Some of you have more burdens than others, and depending on various seasons in life, your burdens might even be too heavy for you to carry, let alone you thinking about trying to carry anyone else's burdens. Even I have my moments when it feels as if my burden load is at capacity and I can't fit in another burden. But what I and we often forget is that the goal is not for us to literally carry these. The goal is for us to listen deeply, hear how someone else is hurting or fearful or worried or anxious or sad, and then to carry that burden or those burdens to God. The intention is not that we would be weighed down with every burden shared. In any community, this would be overwhelming. As your pastor, when you share something difficult with me, I carry your burden. I take you and I take your burden into my heart. I surround you with all the light and love I can muster. But if I think it is my burden to hold and mine alone, I get absolutely stuck. Sometimes people share secrets with me that they have never shared with another human being. And I cannot make that my secret to guard alone forever. It doesn't mean that I tell other people about it, but it does mean that I give it to God to hold and shape and transform. If I do hold something that seems to weigh me down, then it's on me to seek help in the form of counseling or spiritual direction or guidance from one of my wise mentors. It's important that when we feel burdened, we can share it without shame or guilt. We can feel heard and seen, and that we know the people we share it with care about the things we're going through. That can all happen without taking on the physical weight of the burden. Sometimes we also have to create boundaries for ourselves in the midst of community. If one person seems only to share with us their burdens and not share with anyone else in the community, that can be problematic. If our emotional plate is full, it can be helpful to create boundaries around where and when and who shares with us. And it's important to know that sometimes, due to trauma or life experiences, we cannot be the holder or recipient of certain kinds of burdens. And that's okay too, because there are others in the community who can hear and hold those burdens. The next two aspects of carrying community seem to go together. Having an accurate sense of ourselves and not comparing ourselves to others is helpful in becoming a healthy community. Our natural tendency is to compare ourselves to others in every community we're a part of. So overcoming this natural tendency is part of the work for us to do. These two aspects are places where we can bring in some of our childhood wounding if we are not careful. One of the ways I was wounded in my childhood was through abandonment. I won't go into all the details, but the adults in my life were not always consistent or present when I needed them to be. Because of that, I have a need for consistency and presence in communities I am a part of. If someone suddenly disappears or becomes emotionally unavailable, I can easily feel abandoned again. And it feels personal. In communities, whether it's in friendship, partnership, families, church, or volunteer organizations, you can just imagine how sometimes people aren't consistent because they don't necessarily have to be, or sometimes they do disappear, oftentimes for good reason, or sometimes they become distant emotionally. You can also imagine how most of the time those things have absolutely nothing to do with me. But on my side of the equation, it feels like it is all about me. So what I've had to do over time is work on how and when and where and why this childhood wound gets reactivated, and then work on how I choose to respond to it. If I'm unaware of it, imagine how much I would act out in whatever community I'm in, either by leaving in a huff or spreading my anger or hurt to others, or by never fully trusting in a connection with anyone in the first place out of my fear of abandonment. Once I am aware, once we all become aware, we have tremendous choice. I choose to communicate directly and honestly, and 99% of the time, that results in good outcomes. If your childhood wound is that you were taught that you were not good or capable or worthy or lovable, you might have a difficult time having an accurate sense of yourself. Sometimes people with that wound act like they are way more important than they are. Oftentimes, they constantly undersell and underestimate themselves. Both extremes can hurt whatever community that person is a part of. If your childhood wound is that you will never be the favorite child, but will always be the outsider, even in your own family, you're going to have a difficult time accepting that you are a valued member of whatever community you're a part of. The last aspect of caring community is for each of us to carry our own load. This word in Greek is different than the word earlier about burden. This word is in reference to a task or a service. Each person is responsible for or needs to carry their own tasks or services. Seems a little bit weird given that the context is community, where what matters is how it all goes together. We've talked about this so many times in relationship to stewardship, how we share the gifts we have, financially or with time and energy and the spiritual gifts we've been given. This morning, we are going to thank and recognize our choir for an amazing year of music. Each person who's been given the gift of music or singing is to carry their own load, which means using their gift. Each person is responsible for their own gift and using it. Many of you who have gifts of singing have chosen to carry your load by joining the choir. And isn't it incredible when 10 or 12 of you decide to carry your load or offer your service by singing together? The same is true for those who have a passion for justice or for working on how we care for the earth or how we spend our money and care for our facility as a congregation, or even for how we worship. Some of you carry your load by making food for our neighbors in the shelter downstairs. Some of you do it by making food and offering deep hospitality after church on Sundays. The idea here is that we would each realize that in community, everyone has a task or service that is ours. Every year during our stewardship season, when we focus on what gifts or services we're going to offer, we also make it a point to say that because of our changing lives, we sometimes have more or less capacity to offer our task or service, and that has to be okay. Like the geese who fly in formation, we have to be allowed to go to the part of the formation where we can coast in the draft of others for a time. And then, when our circumstances change again, we can offer our gift or task or service differently. If you haven't guessed by now, I have concluded that love languages can be a small part of feeling cared for in community, but caring communities go way beyond love languages. One of the things I said last week, and is still true this week, is that I cannot read your minds, and you cannot read each other's minds or mine. If you are aware of what will help you feel cared for in this community, please communicate it to me and to others that you meet and are in relationship with here. If you feel cared for when you receive words of affirmation or when you're invited to share your particular gifts, let us know that. That's so helpful. If you feel cared for with physical touch, and when people ask you how you are or check in with you when you're here, tell us that. That's helpful. Hosmic, who is not here today, but many of you know, who is 98, has communicated to us that one of the highlights for her in coming to church is getting hugs from people. She lives a relatively solitary life these days because she can't get around as much, and she doesn't get many hugs, so she loves getting them when she's here. That's helpful to know. Even though you might have moments when you think no one here cares about you, or when you feel as though you are not as important as someone else here, I can assure you that will never be the case. Will we make mistakes and sometimes forget to tell you or show you how much we care? Probably, unfortunately. But is it our intention? No. If you will commit to communicating clearly about your needs and how you feel cared for or not, we can all live into our deepest hopes for this community. And it goes without saying that one of our hopes is always that more and more people will come and add to how we shape this community of care. Amen.